Welcome to today's episode of The Square. I am Halima McWilliams, and we are here today with Wanda Dalla Costa, here from Phoenix, Arizona. Welcome, Wanda.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, it has been a great opportunity to have you here. I know we've been talking since 2023, and now we're in 2024, and you've had an opportunity to spend some time with us Corganites. We wanted to bring you here for a few reasons. But before we get into those reasons, I guess tell us a little bit about you. And I know as I was doing research for you coming and this episode, I wanted to you talked about your travels and your travels inspiring your design. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so before I started architecture school, I thought I was going to go on a 6-month backpacking journey to Australia and realized I didn't want to go home. And it ended up being around 7 years
Okay.
that I traveled constantly on one-way tickets around the world.
Wow.
Just exploring culture and seeing visible culture everywhere in the world.
Okay. So is travel your love language then, now, or somewhere in between?
Always.
Always. What is it about travel for you?
I think it's really the broadening, the newness of everything when you travel, from the food to the culture and, the way people practice their life ways. But I think really, of course, urban environments and buildings were part of that exploration.
Yeah.
Seeing very traditional communities still, vibrant in their tradition.
Yeah.
All around the world.
Yeah. So being a part of a First Nations tribe, and as you traveled around the world, what did you see? I guess if you were to think about it as a diaspora, where you were seeing tribes and cultural traditions in these travels, what were some of those kind of unifying similarities and or things that were new discoveries for you?
I think, what happened along the way is that you begin to go from one country to the next and start to understand that a lot of these cultures around the world have the same practices that we have at home. For instance, I remember being in Nepal and I was visiting with, I trekked through the Himalayas. I was all sorts of aches and pains after 10 days in the Himalayas. And I went to see Dalai Lama's doctor.
Wow.
Which anyone can go and see.
Oh.
And he, of course, we didn't speak the same language, but he checks you using pulse points. Mm-hmm. And he could tell that I was having, knee issues from the hike and ended up giving me a traditional medicine, which was a little brown pill that I was mixing with warm water every morning. Yeah. It kind of, tasted very earthy.
Yeah.
And I realized that this was traditional medicine from a Nepalese point of view. And we have traditional medicine at home. It's been outlawed and banned back in our part of the world. Yeah. But here it is still being practiced. So it was those, little occurrences that were happening everywhere I went, where I realized that this trip was really to validate my own culture.
Okay. So as you traveled, as you received, be it medicinal support during your travels, it also, I guess, inspired you or sparked your curiosity for architecture. Was that in a formal sense, or did you discover, this kind of points or steers towards architecture? How did that kind of intersection happen for you?
Yeah, and of course, I was touring a lot of, historic places, UNESCO sites, and seeing all of the amazing traditions. And I realized that architecture as an art form communicates. It makes visible aspects of our culture that have become invisible as Indigenous people.
Okay.
And I remember being at in Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the historic temples, and there was so much culture. They have on the outside of the buildings, they have the bas reliefs.
Okay.
And I happened to meet another traveler. I was by myself, but I happened to meet another gal who was studying bas reliefs.
Okay.
She was an English gal, and we toured around the sites, and she was telling me that the stories embedded in the architecture, just completely inscribed on every surface.
Okay.
And it was those sort of moments where I realized that the power of this object to tell a story.
Yeah.
And I realized I needed to do that.
Yeah. I think that, I'm new to, I'll say new-ish. I've been with Corgan for about 6 years now, but this is my first time working in the AEC environment, the built environment, the design environment. And I'll say as a layperson coming into it, I had a very baseline understanding. I'm still learning things every day. But I think to your point, the the living component of this building telling a story and the vibrancy or sometimes the lack thereof of a building or community reflects history or history that used to be and sometimes is hidden or purposely muted. So it's interesting to see that that's been some of your experiences around the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is it that excites you about design right now?
Well, I think, our firm is a design research firm.
Okay.
We don't just strictly design. We're actually doing research at the same time. I am an academic as well. And so I think for me, I really feel a push right now to, I guess, move away from the abstract, shiny, bright objects, and people are actually trying to understand how environments affect us.
Mhm.
And this is where I'm very intrigued with now, particularly because Indigenous people have never really, they've been handed these box houses that everyone lives at,
Yeah.
on a reservation or reserves up in Canada, but they haven't had the spatial agency. And so I think with the science coming in, I think this opens up a whole new dimension in architecture right now to understand how spaces affect us and what we can do to align humans and
Yeah.
or environments.
Yeah.
I think that's the mission that I'm on right now.
A terminology that one of our architects, we were interviewing someone last year for community conversation for our employees, and this terminology around place-based understanding.
Yeah.
And really just, understanding historically how this place affects people, but also just recognizing the importance and the vibrancy that's required for communities to thrive and or if you extract those basic components how a community can definitely disappear to the point of non-existence. So I think that that's a unique kind of way of thinking and looking at things.
Yeah, last year I remember reading a study that was about public urban space
Okay.
and how some communities of color are not comfortable in these public urban squares for whatever reason. They're not designed accordingly.
Yeah.
And they will not use those spaces. So
Yeah.
who are the spaces built for? It's a very small subset.
Right.
And I think this is where we need to push. We really need to understand what welcome or what belonging feels like.
Correct. Correct. And I guess as you mentioned, you're an academic and you're a professor at ASU, and so of course you're affecting future designers, as they come through your courses. What is the understanding or what is the teaching in regards to precedent study? How does that show up in the curriculum, and how do students and learners connect with that in understanding the importance of be it the indigenous community and or other communities that have been on the margins? How do you center that conversation?
Well, I mean, this is will be a lifetime achievement here to get this passed because we
Yeah.
have a fascination in architecture with a subset of characters.
Yeah.
And I think what we're missing by focusing on this very small select group is we're missing all of the ingenuity and innovation that happens.
Yeah.
We call it place-based creative ecologies. What happens in those far-off corners where they're learning how to deal with a climate or the sun angles or
Sure.
the heat, like from where I'm from. And they have all these place-based innovations that can be brought to the forefront, but we don't
Yeah.
pay attention.
Sure.
And so I think this is another area that I think is ripe for investigation in architecture right now.
Okay. So as you are introducing your students to the indigenous design and the many facets, I'm sure that each tribe isn't the same. So there are different and unique components, but there are also similarities, I'm sure. What are those revelations or aha moments that your students who this is their first time hearing about this and, knowing that, oh, this actually has, a place within the architecture world and history. What have you experienced when you bring this kind of newness to people who are experiencing it for the first time?
Well, we find that this work, regardless if it's a fellow faculty member
Yeah.
that often join us on our initiatives, or if it's a student, but it's very expansive.
Okay.
So, for instance, we had one of the faculty members from the architecture department work with us, at the IDC, the Indigenous Design Collaborative, to help design. And he had typically he goes off into his back room and, creates some sketch and here it is.
Yeah.
And we shifted him away from that process. And we said, we're going to do some place-based research. We're going to do some community engagement. You're going to hear from the community. And it completely upended how his process.
Yeah.
Because he had been doing it kind of based on his own sort of personal, whatever intrigued him about the project. And, given that Indigenous communities are consensus-based, we continuously have to go back to the community and check if we're on the right path.
Yeah.
And so I think that check-in process was also very foreign. And so for him, after this process was done, he said, I've never been involved in a process this elaborate before, and he loved it.
Oh, wow.
All of a sudden, there's this set of new ideas that have emerged through these conversations, through the place-based research.
Sure.
That can inspire him into a new direction.
Yeah.
And we actually found that a lot of the projects that we have done together, that sort of two-eyed seeing where you bring a Western, and an Indigenous mind together, are some of the most interesting projects.
Okay.
And it's for that reason, because it just opens up an area that you wouldn't be typically
exposed to, or So how do we influence, be it current designers, be it you're licensed, not licensed, you're in a small firm, in a corporate firm, whatever that looks like, but also students? How do we teach people to design with and not for?
That it's tricky.
Okay.
It's very tricky. And I think you would have to have someone show you the ropes.
Okay.
And to have an experience like the one that I just mentioned, that we had with a faculty member back at ASU.
Okay.
Because I think now, once he had one experience, he was wanting more.
He sold. Okay.
It was that simple. And usually we're finding that it is the same, because of course our communities are so welcoming, because they've never been asked. No one's ever come to say, well, what color would you like this? What style? What roofline? What is your temperature like? Tell us about your microclimate.
Yeah.
What is the water level? They know all that. They've been living on this land for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
How are we thinking that we can come from the outside with all of the answers?
Sure.
So when we flipped, the process like this, I think for students as well, it's very expensive. I'll give you an example. We did a design in real time out on the Gila River Indian Reservation in Arizona.
Okay.
Where we brought a group of students out there to model in real time while the community members were telling them how to change the house.
Okay.
Total loss of control.
No
for the
pressure.
designers.
Yeah.
But we said, this is what spatial agency looks like. You're going to take a back seat, and you're the vessel through which their ideas flow.
Absolutely.
And it was that transformation, but the general feedback from the group of students was that it was the most amazing experience.
Yeah. Almost like that Ubuntu principle, I am because we are.
Yeah.
If we design for we, and you invite other people to contribute and to, like you said, demonstrate and activate their agency, they're more sold on the end result versus you ultimately saying, no, this is what you need, or I think I know what you're talking about. Just ask them.
Yeah.
I promise they'll tell you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, part of one of my, I don't know if it will ever happen, but imagine if you had a Yelp type app that would actually rate the final result of the architecture by the public.
Yeah. Okay. Or ask AI, and AI is going to tell you. Yeah. Got you. So I guess for my learning, and I'm sure for others who will listen and watch this, what are some of the characteristics of Indigenous design and the Indigenous influence on architecture? I truly don't know, and am curious to hear from you.
Yeah, I think, we've shared, our theory is about connecting to three things, which comes from Amos Rappaport, environmental meanings, their connection to humans, and it's about worldview, lifeways, and identity. So every project that's what we're trying to achieve.
Okay.
But I think one of the most, easy to grasp concepts is connection with nature.
Okay.
So the Indigenous worldview is all about the concept of ethical relationality, which is this relationship of all living things. And for us, that's a very broad grouping of things. And we exist within that system. And the health of ourselves are dependent on the health of everything else in that system. So nothing rises above.
Yeah.
And so our stewardship of the natural world is paramount. And I'll give you an example. In the same community that we were designing the house for the Gila River, where we did the sort of design live, we asked the lady once we came up with the final results, and she says, well, can you show me what it looks like to look out the window? Because the students were all excited about the form. They wanted to really hear comment on the form. And she says, I'm less concerned with the form and I'm more concerned with my view and the relationship with nature.
How can I connect? How can I connect?
That I think is a fundamental difference in
Yeah.
Indigenous design. And we're hearing that from nearly all the communities we work with. There's this extreme affinity, almost like a kinship relationship with Mother Earth.
Yeah. And
that changes design. You know, back in the day, I remember an architecture prof telling me, well, you create the outdoors. When you create the window, you create the outdoors. And I remember thinking, well, that's not quite the way
maybe.
But I'll you know, I didn't want to
go
push
with
back.
you.
I'll go with it,
Yeah.
you know, do what I have to do to get through this. But that fundamental, it's almost like the ego that comes in and places you above and places you outside of, instead of that kind of, you know, the humanity, the shared humanity, the collective intelligence of all the people coming together.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
That's what it's really about.
Yeah. I like that. I like the thinking around identity, but like you said, connecting to nature. And many times we don't even think about it, but when the sun comes out, you feel a way. Your energy is typically different. When it's rainy or cloudy, it inspires you to want to get under a blanket, watch a Lifetime movie, or whatever that thing is, cook a bowl of chili. It tells you in a way what to do. Your environment, i.e. the space, is going to influence how you behave.
Absolutely.
But also, I think in hearing what you're sharing about nature, that connection, it almost is in reverence to nature, in that we got to share this space, this Mother Earth thing, and we need to honor it. But how do I connect with it even when I'm inside of a structure? Yeah. I got you. So I guess, Wanda, tell me a little bit more about your career journey. So you traveled, you've, walked and traveled the 7 seas. Have you done all 7 continents?
Oh, I think I have, yes.
Really? Okay, cool. Favorite place?
I mean, I really like, because traveling just really kind of flips the world over.
Sure.
It takes you out of your comfort zone, which I think is very important for people. And so for that, India is up there right at the top.
Okay.
Because things happen in that country, that you just don't see anywhere else.
Okay.
And so I think that the sort of extreme differences from, culture that we know in North America, I think are intriguing.
Okay. All right. So you've traveled, you've seen some things, you've been inspired by some things, and then you created your collective. And tell us a little bit more about how that started and the catalyst for that.
So I ended up doing some studies at SciArc in Los Angeles. And then after that, I ended up doing a keynote at Arizona State University and was offered a job after that. But when I started to teach, and I was a bit hesitant, I thought, okay, maybe it's time to get out of practice and start, move into academia.
Okay.
But when I started to teach, I realized that I had one trick, and that was working with community and creating buildings. And so I thought, well, maybe my students could actually help me work with community, and it's how you create buildings.
Yeah.
And so we did the first couple of studios. There's sort of a research studio course, and the students loved it. The communities loved it, right?
Okay.
They were finally getting customized, specialized attention in an indigenous way.
Yeah.
And then we created, it's sort of like a community design center at the university. So, we fee for service or grants or, philanthropy, we survived that way, but we help a lot of communities with ideas that, they would have had to pay, I don't know what, in the outside world, right?
Yeah.
We can do it in a student way. Obviously, it's not as professional as having a professional office do it. But then after the student study is done, really this listening sort of session, then we work with local architects to pass the projects on to firms in the city.
Oh, neat.
Yeah.
Okay. So in regards to indigenous designers, and I'll say specifically architects, what has that footprint or that community looked like in the big A world of architecture? How have you, being the first female architect in Canada, what does that look like for you in regards to blazing trails and or also finding your people along the way?
Well, I guess fortunately and unfortunately, it's a
Yeah,
very small community.
sure.
So when I was number 7 in Canada when I became
Okay.
registered, and now there are only about 18. So
Mhm.
it's not that many. In the US, I think there are a lot more, but
Sure.
yeah, I think there's less of a community. Up there, we all know each other.
Of
And we're
course.
starting to actually know the communities down here. As I mentioned, Tammy Eagleby just
Yeah.
joined us at ASU,
Yeah.
and we're all regularly in contact.
Okay.
We team together,
Sure.
we go to conferences together.
Yeah.
So it is a very united community because we're all trying to do the same work.
Correct.
And, as I said to, in a talk last year, there's a lot of different forms of advocacy in the world. And I
Mhm.
think design is a form of advocacy. It's a quiet
1,000%.
form. Back in the day, in my early years, I used to be, fist pumping and wearing myself out, taking my energy away. But then I realized there's other ways to talk about culture.
Yeah.
And, my mission now is really to make visible the pieces of our culture that have become invisible and to uplift them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think creating radically inclusive spaces look like? And how do, be it large firms or just design firms, center that inclusive, accessible, and community-centered thinking? Human-centered design, of course, is what we are aiming for. But
Right.
as you said, the indigenous values are also about nature-centered as well. How do we marry all of these elements to get to this very aspirational place?
I mean, this is an eternal question.
Yeah.
I think needs to be answered because right now we do a lot of collaborations with different architecture
Yeah.
firms. Because we can't take on every project.
Of course not.
We have locals almost in every city, and we're finding that some firms are very open and amenable to listening and
Okay.
to even giving us the pen, giving control.
Nice.
And there are other firms that are really holding on tight to
Yeah.
these last vestiges of power and control
Yeah.
and, whatever else goes along with it. And so we're finding that it varies very much. But I think the one critical aspect for this work, back in, I don't know, you're not an architect, but there's a theory, a 5-step process in architecture. And the first step is empathize,
Yes.
to build empathy.
I'm a design thinking advocate.
Yeah.
So I'm familiar with those. Yes.
Yeah.
With those steps.
And I think the challenge for me is that how can people actually empathize? Like, do you know what it's like to live on the res with no running water?
Yeah.
And actually love it and enjoy it.
Sure.
And think it was the best place
Right.
to grow up in the whole world.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
much better than the urban environment.
Sure.
And so I've often said that we need to actually replace empathy with lived experience. So in a firm this size,
Mhm.
how do you bring the lived experience, those ambassadors that can, I guess, get closer into understanding the different communities that
Yeah.
obviously have a much different starting place,
Yeah.
end goal,
Yeah.
aspirations, priorities.
Sure.
There's so many different ways to look at the world, and
Yeah.
we can no longer assume that the way we have been brought up to look at the world,
Yeah. Yeah.
our individual upbringing,
Yeah.
can apply to other cultures.
No, it's a great point. And I think, like you said, lived experiences, there's nothing that can replace that. And luckily here at Corgan, we have been very open to having conversations and real conversations around bias and around lived experiences and around exposure and even around the P word of privilege, in that and demystifying some of those things, because they can become so weaponized when, if you really understand what some of those things means, it just means that with bias, it's just you trying to shortcut to get to an answer so it fits in a box that you're comfortable with.
Yeah.
Versus sometimes when you learn things, they are going to make you uncomfortable because it wasn't your experience, but you also don't need to avoid it. Because if you avoid it, then you avoid entire groups of people and not honoring their journey and how it can really bring in a better and total picture versus, to your point,
Yeah.
this singular point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I think the nuances, I think it's tricky because there are nuances even in terms of communication. We
absolutely.
just went into an interview last week and the indigenous client said, you know what, the one person on that team, you're local, we think he took too much airspace in that room and
Mhm.
we're actually scared to work with him.
Oh my goodness.
And they wanted us to swap him out.
Yeah,
So this, I think even it comes down to even the communication stuff.
absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
people wanting to get into this work, I think need to do a little homework on all aspects.
Who are you dealing with? Who are you working with? Who are
Yep.
you desiring to work with? And then you have to scan your rooms, your teams. Do we have the right people that are going to be able to connect with so that we don't miss out or miss those shorthands or verbal or physical cues
Yeah.
that tell us we're tracking or we're off track?
Yeah.
But you've got to be consciously aware that the room needs to represent the communities who you're designing for and hopefully designing with.
Yeah.
As you think about, Wanda, you know, your next chapters, be it with the collective and things that you plan to do in the community with your family and things of that sort, I'm sure that young, students, designers are looking at you for the trail that you've blazed in a variety of different ways. But many times, and I'm sure in your journey, it wasn't linear, maybe not even what you expected. So, what would you tell a future designer as they think about embracing those squiggly lines? What should they be open to?
So I think one of the most impactful moments that I could, if you pay attention to how you feel, and in architecture school, it was when the professor told me that open window and I'm creating the earth. And
Yeah.
I thought right there, I'm not buying any of it. And I realized at that moment, it was the gut reaction and it was the intuition. And they say that it kicks in when it needs to kick in.
Yes.
And it kicked in at that time.
Okay.
And had I not listened to it, had I been less, I guess, courageous to challenge him and
Mhm.
to ask questions
Okay.
and to raise my voice
Yeah.
as an Indigenous woman in a profession that is, I was largely, standing on the outside, I don't think I would be here today. So it was very important when I traveled that I built the voice. I built that confidence. I went around the world 7 times on
Yeah.
my own. I've seen things that a lot of people haven't seen.
Okay.
I have a voice.
Yeah.
And it was then when I started to use it. And I remember talking to my classmates after, and I said, why did you jump in and support me? Because they said after, we agreed with you. I said, nobody said anything. Right. Just left me sitting there in this awkward blank space.
Yeah.
That's so. But nonetheless, it was started from then to really be able to trust your gut, to know what you think you know, and
Sure.
to actually just say it.
Sure.
And yes, maybe I'm going to make a mistake. I've probably made thousands of mistakes every year.
Yeah.
But unless we push and poke and nudge and, shove sometimes,
Yeah.
we will never get to a more equitable place.
Yeah.
We have to do it.
Yeah.
We have to.
Yeah.
So that's what I would tell is just trust that seed.
Trust the seed.
Yeah.
Trust the seed. So a couple more questions for you. And I want to make sure that we, having your voice here, what is it about, I guess, a myth or a misunderstanding about Indigenous design and the built environment? What do you think people don't know or think they know and it's wrong?
Right. I mean, part of the big myth, I think, that surrounds the field is, I talk about it a lot when I lecture. It's the Futurist Manifesto. This was a piece written back in 1909, which talked about the only way to move forward is to dissolve everything that existed beforehand, all the wealth of knowledge, the values, the principles, everything in our world, and to start fresh. And I think that was really the start of the demise, I think.
Okay.
But what I also think it did is that this modernism movement that went and sort of annihilated all of the diversity and the culture within the field of architecture, and it pushed for this sort of homogeneous, efficient outlook in architecture, actually caused its own demise. And I think now the reverse is happening where people are just exhausted from the sameness.
Cookie
the
cutter.
same
Good Lord.
building systems from north to south,
Sure.
same towers from Dubai to Shanghai. That there is that sort of place-based creative ecology that could happen
Okay.
is sort of reduced
Yeah.
and simplified. And I think people are actually now moving more towards this sort of uniqueness of each place. And I think that is where Indigenous design fits really beautifully in, because there is no one that is more connected to places than the Indigenous people who have been in these places for thousands of years, that know which way the clouds are flying and the water's going to rise.
Sure.
And I remember reading, there's a guy called Lenny on TikTok. He's an Inuit fellow. And every time he crosses the ice, he has to read the clouds to see whether it's safe, because the clouds tell him when the water is thick enough. These are the types of knowledges that we are losing. Those little tiny place-based knowledges that live in all of these communities around the world, not only in North America, all across the shore.
Yeah.
And I think that's the push that people are after right now. And so I thank modernism for coming in and trying to wipe the slate clean, because I think it made room for a lot of other voices and narratives to be heard.
Okay. You talked about, we were having a conversation with our employees earlier, and you made reference to a unique quote that I think will live with me for a while now, but walking into the future backwards. Tell me kind of why that rang for you, and what does that mean for you?
Yeah, it's the Maori New Zealand people, Kapmura Kamuri. And I think what it really means is the generations that have gone on before us.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's an emotional topic.
Okay. Yeah.
But the generations that have gone on before us have so much to give and so much knowledge.
Yeah.
And for us to cut it off and to assume that it's not relevant,
Yeah.
and to think that the solutions, what we're seeing today, is better than what we had before,
Yeah.
such a misguided perspective.
Yeah.
Right? Look at our world. Look at AI right now. We're like, who's running this ship? Who's
Yeah.
going to man this ship?
Yeah. Yeah.
I often say, if you brought a group of elders to manage AI,
Yeah.
they would fix all the problems, right? They
Yeah.
would be guiding by collective responsibility, ethical, considerations, morality, creating an umbrella system of values around AI.
Yeah.
Right? We
Yeah. Yeah.
we don't have those frameworks anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think when we walk backwards into the future, it's about learning from what has gone before.
Sure.
And bringing that knowledge in such a beautiful way to guide the future.
Yeah.
And that's walking backwards into the future.
I love that, just because I think one of the things that I've heard from you throughout our day together is this acknowledgement of the elders. And I'll say in my family, we speak Swahili, and one of the terminologies that we use for family is jamaa. And in the jamaa, elders are reverenced. They are revered for their wisdom, for their knowledge. And you mentioned TikTok, and that I'm not on TikTok. I refuse. But what I've heard of TikTok is that these trends that happen, a lot of them are not trend, or they think they're these new things.
Yeah.
But if you look back, your parents or an elder were saying, we did that 20 years ago. We did that 60 years ago. So the disconnect between what is current and new is really nothing is new under the sun. But when you distort the story or you disconnect from the elders, you miss out on, really, to your point, problem solving that's staring you right in the face.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. So a couple of rapid fire questions, and then we'll wrap up. What is your favorite day of the week?
Saturday.
Why?
I get to spend it with my kids.
Okay, good. I love a good Saturday.
They're so energetic, and it just makes me happy.
Awesome. Tell me about, fill in this blank for me. Beyonce is.
Beyonce?
Beyonce. Beyonce is.
Powerhouse.
Powerhouse. Okay. Got it. And if I could ask you one last question, it would be, what do you want to be remembered for?
Um, I don't know. I guess, my head is down most of the time. And so as long as they remembered that I just tried as hard as I could to push the gate open. And maybe I opened the gate, hopefully.
I think you did. I think you did. Well, Wanda, thank you so much for spending time with us. We know that hopefully your travels here in Dallas have been pleasant and your time with us has been good as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for inviting.
Absolutely. Well, it has been another great episode of The Square. We hope to see you again next time. Thanks so much.